Welcome, everybody. It's great to see so many folks here joining us today for a really interesting conversation on an important piece of the jigsaw for the UK at the moment, the role of business in delivering the UK's net zero ambition. My name's Emily Farnworth. I'm the Deputy Director of the Climate Change Centre at Hughes Hall, University of Cambridge, which hosts Chapter Zero. And it's great that Chapter Zero and the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales are hosting the event today. It's going to be a really important topic for all of their members, particularly in the context of the role that boards and chief financial officers have to play in this really important piece of delivering on our net zero goal. I'm going to introduce you quickly to our speakers. Chris Stark, the CEO of the UK Committee on Climate Change. Ruth Cairnie is Chair of Babcock International and also one of the supporting chairs of Chapter Zero. And Iain Wright, Director of Business and Industry Strategy at the Institute of Chartered Accountants for England and Wales. We're going to just kick off with a couple of housekeeping rules, and then I'm going to ask Chris to present to us a little bit more information about the carbon budget, but just a few pieces of housekeeping. It's obviously a very short session that we have today, and we really do want to hear from all of the speakers and hear the conversation that, of all the important points that they want to raise. So we're not going to have an open chat. We have also already got some information from you all about the kinds of questions that you'd like to ask the speakers. So we've woven those into the panel discussion. So we also won't be having an open Q&A at this point. You'll probably notice that we're recording this session, so just to make you aware of that, and it will be available to folks to watch if you've got colleagues that weren't able to join us live today. Just want to say again a thank you to our hosts, Chapter Zero and the Institute of Chartered Accountants. For those of you that are not aware, Chapter Zero is a membership organisation for non-exec directors, and it's doing really important work in making sure that they're aware of best practice for climate governance on boards. And this is going to be a fundamental piece of the conversation today in terms of the role that boards have in addressing some of the challenges, the business changes that need to take place. So if you're not already a member, do reach out to the team. And also just a final point, both the Institute of Chartered Accountants and Chapter Zero will be sending notes to their members from this conversation. So you'll have an opportunity to follow up with any questions that have come up during the conversation that aren't answered directly by the speakers in this session. So really looking forward to this conversation. Obviously, the UK's sixth carbon budget is a critical piece of the jigsaw, if you like, in terms of helping us as the business community to understand what needs to happen. So it's going to be great to hear from Chris a little bit more about that, and in particular, what the role of business is in delivering that net zero ambition. So I'd like to, again, once again, introduce Chris Stark to maybe go through a few slides to help us understand a little bit more of the budget, and over to you, Chris, to talk us through this important document.
Thanks so much, Emily. So let me just share my screen, and good morning to everyone. Really pleased to join you this morning. It's good to do a morning meeting as well. I've been doing lots of evening meetings recently. I'm in Glasgow today. As you can probably see, the sun is still coming up. So those of you in the south of the country may wonder why there's this blue EV light coming in, but I'm based in Glasgow, where of course we're going to be having the UN climate talks at the end of this year. So that's a kind of nice way to kick us off, I think, thinking about that and the things that will be happening in this city in just a few months' time. I'm going to just for 10 minutes or so talk to you about net zero, and in particular the piece of work that we published at the end of last year. And I just want to start by talking about my organisation. So the Climate Change Committee is an organisation that was established in 2008 by the UK's climate law, so the Climate Change Act. Many of you will know of us, I hope. Many of you will not. So we are here to do something quite unusual, which is to provide independent advice to governments, also to the broader society, about the steps that we need to take to meet the statutory targets that we have in the UK. Very occasionally, we're tasked with something else, which is to advise on whether we have the right targets and of course, how we meet those targets. So in 2019, we did an enormous piece of work to advise that the UK should set a new target for cutting emissions. And that target is net zero emissions by 2050. We'll talk about that in just a second. And then every 5 years, we do something else, which is to advise on what the interim targets should be for cutting emissions on the way to that long-term goal. And that's what we did in December last year. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. That next interim target that we've advised on is called the 6th carbon budget. And the crucial point is that that carbon budget is the target for the mid-2030s. So it's the thing that's really going to guide us to the long-term goal. And we did a really huge piece of work, 1,000 pages, which I absolutely promise I will not take you through in detail this morning, but really worthwhile if you're at all interested in seeing what the journey for the UK looks like. This morning, I'm going to give you an outline of that. So I just want to kick off, if I can, with this slide. And please don't worry if you can't see everything on it, but a simple statement really to kick us off, which is that 15 to 20 years is the average life of a capital asset that uses fossil fuels today in this country. So something bought today is quite likely to still be in use in 2040. That outlook has had a huge impact on the work that we've been doing to establish a pathway for the UK to net zero. Because if the date is 2050 to achieve net zero, then you have to knock 20 years off it to understand, at what point we have to start selling zero carbon assets, buying zero carbon assets to meet the zero carbon date on time. And that idea of turning over capital assets as much as possible at the end of their useful economic life, doing so in such a way that we get the minimum of fuss over this transition, is a really important part of the analysis that we've been putting together recently. So that idea of the steady turnover of capital assets has really determined a lot of the path that I'm about to show you. And if you think about it, if you look at some of the numbers on these tables, you see that we're really up against it. So there are assets being bought today that will be around in 35 years' time. And that really is a challenge. So thinking about it in that way, the big message to kick us off is that by 2030 or thereabouts, we have to reach the point where new sales of capital assets in most sectors are zero carbon. So just think about that challenge across the various sectors of the UK economy. Either we do it this way so that we get a kind of nice managed transition to zero carbon, or we have to scrap assets in the future. We have to strand assets in the future. Investors don't like that, as you will know. Consumers don't typically like that either. So that idea of scrapping capital assets is the way to find a strategy that will not have public support. So 2030 actually is the key date, if 2050 is the thing that we care about. So just bearing that in mind, let's have a very brief outlook on what we published in December. This is our recommended pathway for the UK to reach net zero on that purple dotted line you can see there. There's a lot to take in here in this chart, so don't worry, I'll navigate it for you. You can see in the orange box there, the 6th carbon budget target that I talked about. It's the period in orange. And the headline of this chart is that what we've advised the UK government should do is set its greenhouse gas emissions target in that period, 2033 to 37, in line with that orange box. The implication of that is that the UK will have to cut its greenhouse gas emissions by nearly 80% by 2035 if the UK ministers decide to agree with our recommendation, and they have to legislate that at some point this year. So there's a big decision coming up. It's worth saying that target of 80% reduction is the old target we used to have for 2050 just a couple of years ago. So until we advised on resetting the long-term goal, that was the long-term goal. So we brought that forward by 15 years. And the implication of that is that we're going to have to achieve a faster pace of emissions reduction over the next 30 years than we did in the last 30. That's really important because it's a really strong message, of course, on what we're doing on climate change here in this country as we shape up for that conference at the end of the year. But more importantly, the implication of that kind of that path that you see there is that we need to invest early. That's going to support the economic recovery. It's also going to open up options for decarbonisation in the future. Those options will include new industries, new jobs, new opportunities commercially. So doing it early, not only does it minimise the amount of cumulative emissions that the UK is responsible for and putting that into the atmosphere, it's also essential in opening up the new commercial opportunities. So that's broadly what we said. And the interesting thing to see is that S-shaped chart, that S shape that you see on that purple line, that tells a nice story about what needs to, what has been and what needs to come next. Basically, we've run out, or are shortly going to run out of the kind of easy options to cut emissions, in particular by closing coal-fired power plants. That's been a big part of the story of cutting emissions in the UK to date. What we now need to do is scale up all the emission reduction strategies in every other sector. And then you get this kind of initial plateau, which is us scaling up, in particular, the government policies that will support that, the commercial strategies that will support that, and then the emissions reduction follow. So that's the kind of broad story. If I just go on to just say a bit more about that, if we just zoom out and just consider how you get to that strategy overall, that's the key thing here. It's easy to advise on the path. The question is, what can you do to get to that path that we have advised? This is the emissions abatement, as we would call it, to deliver that balanced path that we call it, with the scenario that we've advised on the UK government should follow. And this tells you how we've achieved it in our analysis. So what we've built is a profile of change over time. What you can see is that it falls quite neatly into these four strategies for cutting emissions that you can see on the right of this chart. The purpley stripes at the top are about demand reduction, about energy efficiency in the economy. This is in particular homes being more insulated. So it's also us being more resource efficient. If you look near term on this chart, you'll see that that makes up actually quite a lot of the carbon abatement that we've plotted out. By 2050, it's a smaller proportion of the total carbon abatement, but that's what props up progress over the coming 5 to 10 years, actually. So think about that for the businesses that you are working with right now. That idea of being more resource efficient, more energy efficient, is a really important part of the strategy in the short term. The red, the orange and yellow bits on this chart, this rainbow chart, are all about the UK adopting low carbon technologies. So this for me is the most exciting part of the story, that story of asset turnover that I began with. This is the electric cars in the economy that we're using. This is the heat pumps that are heating buildings in the UK. It's also hydrogen technologies. There's a bit of carbon being captured from industry where we're still using fossil fuels in that wedge too. So that's the kind of orangey bit. The third bit here is the blue bit. That's the low carbon fuels that we need to run the economy, to run those technologies. So this is us completing the job on decarbonising the power system in the UK, building out that offshore wind, big part of that strategy in the UK as well. Low carbon hydrogen is in that wedge too. And then the final bit is the green stripe, which reminds us that this isn't just an energy story. It's a whole economy, whole system, whole UK story that involves us also thinking about the natural world. So there will be some sources of emissions that will endure into the future in our net zero world. That's the net bit of net zero, especially from cows and sheep and planes. So we have to have something that offsets that. So this is us actively removing CO2 from the atmosphere by using trees, energy crops to absorb carbon from the atmosphere, which we can then use some of them at least potentially in the energy system itself with carbon capture and storage. So that green wedge is a very important part of the overall story. That's what we advised. That's the helicopter view. 2 more minutes just on what that implies. What we can do now is because we've built that transition over time, is we can also build a profile of the capital investment that's necessary to deliver it. So I did want to bring that to you this morning. It amounts to about £50 billion of extra investment per year. We scale that up over the next decade across the economy. Most of that will be private investment. Most of that falls in 3 sectors. So it's the electricity supply story. So that's the infrastructure for the low carbon electricity that we'll need. It's decarbonised buildings, and it is in particular, the purple wedge that you see there is the transport story. So investing particularly in electric vehicles and charging infrastructure. So that extra 50 billion a year of investment is what delivers us net zero. It also happily delivers us something else, which for the first time we've been able to plot out, which is a fuel saving across the economy. So this is the money that we're not spending on fossil fuels, using these more efficient, usually electrified technologies. And that over time offsets the capital investment cost. And that's really exciting because it does then have an implication for the overall cost of this transition. We now think it's much smaller than previous assessments that we've made, actually probably less than 1% of GDP in any one of those years, if you look at the aggregate position. Just one final chart on this before I deal with very briefly what we've advised about business. The final thing is that there's a bit more going on than just investment. If you can look at the mix of things that are delivering that kind of emissions reduction that I just talked about, some of it is pure technology change. So changing fuels or closing coal-fired power plants is been a big part of the strategy for the UK so far. But the majority of it is actually a mixture of things that involve changing consumer behavior, citizen behavior. So that is for me the big story here. There is a big element of lifestyle shift occurring over that period out to 2035 on this chart, and then to 2050. Actually, more than half of the emissions reductions that we are predicting would be necessary by 2035 involve some behavioural or societal change. Now that for you is really interesting. This is a big opportunity for retail innovation. Nothing to be afraid of here. This is plugging in your car rather than taking it to the filling station, heating your home with a heat pump rather than with a gas boiler. But these are changes to people's lives. We have to build the public consent for them. And I think they're going to have a deep and meaningful impact on commerce too. So it's that lifestyle transition, I think, that really marks this out as the big topic of the age. And then the final slide from me, just to highlight really that we published, I think, a really, really good guide to satisfy the big demand that we know there is out there to understand what corporate's role is in that transition that I've just described. We know there's a big demand to understand that. You can see that in the explosion of corporate commitments that we've seen to net zero, and that's been wonderful. We've tracked some of that in this document. I would love to see this taken seriously in boardrooms in the UK. It is not just a corporate social responsibility thing, but it really needs to be a kind of meaningful part of corporate strategies going forward over the next 10, 20 years. We need businesses, of course, to invest in all the things I've just talked about, to take, of course, account of the emissions that they are responsible for. For many of the businesses that are on that transition, this is going to be a pretty fundamental shift. The logic of this is that businesses themselves make this transition, not that they are put out of business, that they themselves make the transition. So some big questions out there, which we've tried to answer in the report that we published alongside the sixth carbon budget that I've just told you all about. It's tempting when I talk to think of it all as a big policy challenge, as a big set of messages for government. It's really not. For the UK to get to that transformation that we need for net zero, it's really a government policy and UK corporate action working in unison that will deliver it. So that's a really important message that we've tried to bring out in our most recent work. Broadly, we see government's role as providing the stable and the fair framework for businesses to deliver that net zero economy that I've talked about. They need to provide long-term visibility, long-term certainty about some of the things that will need to be done across the economy, create that level playing field, of course, with businesses outside of the UK who will also be making that journey perhaps more slowly than the UK. But against those frameworks and those supporting policies, it's the private sector that's going to drive the transition. So what we set out here, and I won't go into detail, is just some guides and some guidance rather on what the corporate community can do along that journey. And we've boiled it down to these 5 messages. The first is do the basics, measure your emissions, measure your corporate emissions, disclose them, target action in the right way, of course, plan against that, and then act. And I would suggest you also need to adjust that plan as it plays out. Secondly, adopt the highest possible ambition for cutting emissions in the business. Building resilience to climate change itself is another part of that. Thirdly, address all emissions. So look across the 3 scopes, as we call them, of emissions that you're responsible for, in particular, the emissions that occur in your supply chain. And go beyond them where possible. So we've got 2 really important areas in the report where we can suggest ways to advance progress beyond those 3 scopes of emissions. So firstly, it's companies leading the transition towards electric vehicles, big story for the UK. Secondly, using corporate renewables procurement, not just to get a green tariff for the company, but actually to grow the installed base of low carbon electricity generation rather than just purchasing from existing generations. That will generation sources. That will be a step to support the UK transition overall beyond the 3 scopes that you're responsible for. Fourthly, bringing climate change into the boardroom, so bringing it up to the highest levels of corporate leadership, ensuring crucially that climate action is given that board level attention and especially CEO responsibility. It's a meaningful condition of success, I think, for corporates in the modern economy to do that. So aligning executive pay, executive focus with that climate objective is really important, I think, to that challenge overall. And lastly, it might surprise you to hear me say this, but minimizing the use of offsets, which typically are used quite regularly in the corporate community as a means to demonstrate your support for the climate objectives. Minimizing them and instead getting out and focusing on permanent emissions reductions. Those offsets are often ropey. They're against a difficult set of frameworks, and often they don't deliver the emissions reductions that they claim. So it's better to focus on reducing the emissions actually in the business than it is to use those offsets. So I'm going to stop there, and perhaps we can move then to a discussion about all of that. And over to you.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was incredible. And it's really good to just pack so much information into just a few slides. I mean, I think you've been very clear, both in the report and in your presentation, just to sort of demonstrate where we're going to get the emissions cuts from, and specifically some of the, the very kind of, basic things that companies need to do. I'm going to maybe ask a question coming from a perspective from a company that's maybe quite early on in the journey, and then talk a little bit more about the ones that are a bit more sophisticated. But for those early on in their journey, and in particular thinking about, our audience here in the boardroom, what kinds of questions should the board start asking in order to kind of sort of start the ball rolling for having a conversation and being able to actually operationalize some of these things that you've said that need to happen?
Well, I mean, so I wouldn't claim to know that there's I wouldn't claim to give you a kind of perfect prescription for this, but it starts for me with an awareness of the issues. So, I mean, this net zero thing, which has become a bit of a slogan, is actually a real and scientific target. So, for me, the beginning of this discussion is, what does net zero mean? What is that? Is that understood in the business? And then following on from that, are we aware of what contribution in this business we are making to that problem that we have at the moment of greenhouse gas emissions? Because once you understand those two things, you can start to make a strategy, and that's essentially the first of the five summary points that I left you with in my final slide. So, starting to measure, starting to raise awareness, starting to target the things that you can do to cut emissions, and then acting on that and adjusting the strategy is the kind of broad message that we're giving. But actually just raising awareness of it, in my experience, is the first step to raising a kind of really interesting discussion about what the corporate strategy is more generally over the next decade.
Yeah. And you also pointed out that perhaps the window is closing on the easy things to do, and we are going to have to start talking about the more challenging ones. But again, do you see any sort of steps that companies can take there where they will get a little bit of, a sort of a cut in their emissions in the early stages, and then how do they start to plan for these decisions, particularly the investment decisions that need to be taken now if we're going to, get to that 2030 goal?
Yeah, so you're right. So there isn't much low-hanging fruit. There's been a lot that's been happening, outside most, the consumer, and indeed, and I would count businesses as a consumer in this discussion, hasn't noticed some of the big steps that the UK has been taking over the last 15 years to cut emissions, because they've been big centrally planned steps in the energy system. So the fact that this year we will probably have more than half of the electricity that's supplied from zero carbon means, that is a dramatic change, which mostly people haven't noticed. That's amazing when you think about it. But the thing that given that we're in that position, you can draw on that electricity that you're using in the business and know that half of that is going to be decarbonized. That's a nice thing. The things that you need to do in the business itself, I would say top of the list is that top of that purple wedge that I showed you on the rainbow chart. It's about resource efficiency and energy efficiency. So thinking about ways in which you can reduce your consumption of high carbon things, including energy at the moment, is a really obvious step, and it has a nice happy benefit that you're not just cutting emissions, you're also typically making the business more efficient. So that bringing together that idea of a more productive business with a business that has a lower footprint on the environment is I think the first place that I would always start.
I think what's also quite promising about the narrative that we have in the UK at the moment, and you just highlighted, it's actually quite an optimistic starting point in some ways. Although there isn't necessarily easy things to do right now, we're also starting in a position where we can build on. It's not like we're starting from scratch, and the kind of the pathway that you've shown is actually doable if we all kind of pull our weight.
That's so important. I mean, I've been doing this job for 3 years, but I've been in and around this now for more than a decade. And it used to be quite a desperate discussion for people who worked on climate change. And it's quite interesting. I came from a different place entirely. My background is working on economic policy, various places in government, not on the environmental stuff. So I found myself working on energy issues, and about 10 years ago, and then found my way into the climate discussion. Now, for me, what I could see happening was a story of a tremendous progress coming at it from that kind of perspective, that lots and lots of investment in low carbon energy system in the UK, lots of ambition in the policy sense. Now, I take that optimism into all the other things that we now need to do. Top of the pile is that story on transport. We're doing great things in the UK on energy decarbonisation. The next thing is the story, I think, on transport. And the happy story, the optimistic story, is that it brings together that story of what's been happening in the energy system. So we've been decarbonising energy and doing so with cheaper and cheaper renewables, especially. That is now the future. You know, that cheap renewable power that we'll have in the future also happens to be the cheapest possible source of electricity. That's amazing. Couple that together with this other story that's been playing out over the last 10 to 15 years of cheaper and cheaper batteries. You have a recipe for massive disruption in the transport sector, and you see that in the automotive sector right now. So we will be using that cheap power with storing it in cheap batteries and using it in electric vehicles in the future. And that means that today, as I talk to you, I think it will be cheaper to decarbonize our transport system than not. And that's an amazing step, because the big story for this audience is that you can fuel that transition by going early on electric vehicles, knowing that in the future, the power for that vehicles will be cheap. The vehicles themselves are more energy efficient. They're a great experience as well. There's a lovely, kind of story about what you can do with tariffs for those vehicles too, charging them off peak when it's quite cheap to do that. All of that stuff has really come together. So I'm properly optimistic about not just reaching net zero, but doing so quickly.
Yeah. And also, I think we have to recognise we've got some incredible leading companies in the UK as well, which no doubt will kind of, have their moment in the spotlight at COP. But at the same time, because there's a great cohort of organisations that have been leading the charge, they're also now facing the kind of the place where they're finding it kind of more and more difficult, and increasingly a recognition, particularly for some of the heavy industry or some of the trickier sectors, as you pointed out, there's going to be a need for more public-private kind of collaboration to be able to sort of make these next transformational steps. So again, if you're in a boardroom of a company that's done a lot of these first steps and is now thinking, oh gosh, well actually now I need to make a serious decision about investment in infrastructure going forward, I guess there's two questions there. One is sort of, again, and I appreciate it's a difficult question, but it's a nice place to perhaps think about yourself in a board meeting, giving advice to the team. But also, what would your advice be both on how they tackle it as a board, but what kind of interactions should they perhaps think about in the context of talking to government about this as well?
So, it's not a difficult question for me, actually, because I think that is at the very heart of what needs to happen next. So, rather too many people like me have been talking too much about government doing all of this, but it's not just a story about government policy, but it is a story, I think, initially at least, of government leadership. So I have to say I'm in the unusual position in this role of being quite pleased with the government at the moment, because I think they're providing some of that strategic vision, at least. What needs to happen next is, for those of you who follow any of this, I'm a proper, policy wonk. I really love all this stuff, but we are in a completely unprecedented period now of change when it comes to that environment. And I think that is a story that we need to accept, that boardrooms across the country are going to have to keep pace with some of that, sadly. That there is just an astonishing amount of change taking place. If you look at what the Prime Minister said at the tail end of last year, in what he called his 10-point plan. There's a few more than 10 points in it, but let's not criticise. The 10-point plan was an amazing thing for a British Prime Minister to set out in the middle of a pandemic. Really, really astonishing. So just a set of missions right across the economy to cut carbon and to get to net zero. So you can see a Prime Minister here that is very much hanging his hat on net zero as a means to grow the economy, which is a fascinating new insight into how the government is viewing this. But also it's his answer to levelling up, this kind of change across the country that he sees happening. So the implication of that 10-point plan is it's a bit more than just in fact, it's not really a plan at all, it's a vision. So there's the kind of litany of changes that will flow from that. In the transport system, there's policies promised. In the energy system, there is policies promised. Housing, food systems, all food changes to land use. All of that kind of flows from the 10-point plan. So in the next 12 months, as we run up to that climate summit, I think you're going to be in a process of quite a lot of change when it comes to policy. Then I hope that will settle down. So then I hope we will have the kind of long-term certainty that I talked about in my talk just a few minutes ago. Yeah. That long-term certainty should give the confidence to invest, I hope. And that confidence to invest is hugely important, because I want to make this kind of final point on this question, that I told you a really nice, optimistic story about the cost of this transition, which started with the investments necessary across the economy to cut carbon. and the investments carry with them these cost savings over time. That's a great story in aggregate, and I believe that is how it will pan out. But of course, if that investment carries a big risk, then there's a big cost of capital to that. There's a big financing charge on that cost on that capital investment program over the next 30 years. And I think a lot of that will depend on whether business has confidence in the policies that government puts in place over the next 12 months. Because if they do, then you can expect quite a low premium on that capex, and that overall has a big impact on the cost of this transition to the whole economy. So, I do think there's a need for government and industry to genuinely talk through what needs to happen next, in the belief that we'll get there, of course. But that message of the need to set out long-term frameworks that provide price certainty to those who make those investments is something that government really needs to hear, because they have at their disposal some big tools to deliver that investment in the right way to get us to net zero in a low-cost way across the economy. I don't believe it's going to cost at all, actually, if we put those steps in place early. In particular, the investing as we come out of a deep recession like the one we've been in 2020 is a really sensible step. We actually think would boost GDP. So, getting that right over the next 12 months, that conversation between commerce and industry, being aware of what's happening in the policy space, perhaps more than you would otherwise at boardroom level, is a good sensible step to take over the next 12 months.
Absolutely, and probably some work for our hosts to be thinking about how to help facilitate that as well, no doubt. Well, I'd like to bring Ruth Cairnie and Iain Wright into the conversation now, and just to kind of maybe initially ask for any sort of initial responses to what you've heard from Chris. Obviously, what we're keen now to hear is, kind of the perspective that you're both bringing from the business community. So maybe Ruth first, just any reflections on what you heard from Chris.
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, thanks, Chris, for the phenomenal, fast, comprehensive talk on that. I mean, let me start maybe by saying what perspective I'm coming at this from. So I am coming at this as a non-executive director. So this is the board level. I am absolutely not a deep expert on climate change, but I have got involved with Chapter Zero as one of the NEDs who recognises that, this is really important and it has to come from the board, setting the whole agenda. I do think that, as has been mentioned, businesses are in such different places on this, from the cutting edge businesses to those who are really at quite an early stage. And, I'm thinking as well that, that's true even across the FTSE 350 companies. But then if you think about all the SMEs in the supply chain who are really going to have to play a critical role as well, it's a huge spectrum. And I'm looking at this from the perspective of non-executive directors like me who really recognize we need to get going, or we need to push ahead on this. I think there's been a big change from, over maybe 5 years, from let's wait and see and wait until we have to do something and we're forced to really wanting to be proactive and driving the agenda. And in that respect, I think the sixth carbon budget and everything you've just gone through, Chris, in one sense, it's a huge step up in ambition, because you're talking about going much further, faster than we were looking at before. So that's a challenge. But I think that the spelling out of how it can look and what can happen when is enormously helpful, because it enables companies to grow in confidence about what they need to be, what path they are going to have to be navigating, and those markers that will help to shape company strategy. And I think that's what you've been saying. I think you've covered in your talk and also in the report, which I haven't gone through the 1,000 pages, but I've looked at some of it. It really strikes me.
I haven't been through it all as well, I'll be honest with you.
Well, then I feel much better. I think the point that you've just made, that policy action needs to happen now. We need to see things now, because a lot of this is about confidence. I think that this is really happening, And when the policies are in place to start to tie down that trajectory, I think that is going to be very helpful. And absolutely the confidence that this is going to be for the long term, you know, that we're not at risk of investing with one set of assumptions and then something different is going to play out. I think the point that is made very strongly in the report about the importance of a systemic approach is very important, because, you know, if you're working in one sector of the economy and you're driving this agenda in a particular way, but you see other sectors and other parts of the economy that seem to be going in the different direction, that I think really saps the confidence to forge ahead within your own sector. And I think this recognition of the need to recognize and overcome barriers as they become apparent, because we absolutely don't know in detail how this will all play out. There's a lot of technologies that need to emerge and structures and models that need to be developed. So the absolute importance of collaboration through that, that businesses are able to really be giving their voice into what they need in order to make some of these critical steps and investments. So I also feel very optimistic and encouraged, because I think that what you've just talked through is a huge help for businesses. But my goodness, that doesn't mean that it's by any means easy. No. You know, that it's enormously challenging, but these are very helpful steps.
Yeah, thank you, Ruth. That's really helpful reflections. And Iain, similarly, what are your sort of initial responses, reflections from what Chris has outlined?
Like Ruth, Emily, I think it's really important. I think Chris's presentation showed a degree of optimism. It's going to be hard, but there's an inherent optimism there. And I just want to pick up on something that you said to Chris earlier on, Emily, which is we are coming from a position of strength and a position, you know, a good, strong foundation. You know, in the last 30 years or so, the UK economy has grown by 2/3, but in that time, since 1990, CO2 emissions has fallen by 44%. What we've done is decouple economic growth with environmental damage. And that's a great step. And as Chris says, a lot of that was large-scale energy systems, taking coal-fired power stations offline. So the difficult stuff needs to be done, but that is inherently optimistic. I think businesses struggle on a number of levels. And I just want to summarize. First is about the culture of a company. You know, the board has to really believe in this and has to show leadership. The tone from the top on a whole range of matters, particularly on things like climate change, is absolutely essential. And so non-exec directors, senior leaders in business and in companies really do need to take up that leadership role. The other thing, and I think Ruth mentioned this and it's really important, is size. Don't forget, 99.9% of British businesses employ fewer than 50 people. We are a nation of micro and small businesses. And so, you know, the vast majority of enterprises in the UK will be going, how on earth do we start on this? We quite like to think about climate change, but I'm just thinking about how do I pay the next bill, the wage bill? How do I cope with economic demand falling because of the pandemic? So I think making sure that you can hold small businesses' hands on this is really important on that. And that links in with my final point I wanted to mention here, which is sectors. Different sectors will have different roles to play on this. Chris mentioned quite rightly the importance of transport. Surface transport constitutes 22% of our emissions in this country, and road haulage has got a few issues at the moment to deal with. So in terms of the bandwidth to be able to look at this, but I think it's really important that from a sector by sector basis, the notion of, you know, what do we need to do and what do we need to do now in order to capture the enormous opportunity, as well as minimize as much as possible the damage to our business. This is a great time. And I think if there is real hope about building back better after this economic devastation caused by the pandemic, I think the idea of having a sustainable economy in every sense is something to be celebrated, and business really needs to chase that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You brought up 2 points that I want to kind of come back to, and one I'll kind of maybe sort of start with Chris in terms of a question. You mentioned this issue of the UK doing such a fantastic job of decoupling its economic growth from emissions reductions, which is absolutely the case. Many of the organisations that we're engaging with are international businesses. And whilst that's a fantastic story to tell in the UK, with so much kind of import going on, what's the responsibility for us? And Chris, you mentioned this in terms of the scope 3. What's the responsibility now of UK businesses to start to think about how do they support that kind of decoupling, if you like, in other parts of the world, given that, you know, it's really a kind of a UK requirement to think about net zero? What would your response be there, Chris?
Yeah, so we've been thinking quite a lot about that particular issue. So it may be important to just say at the start that the targets that I talked about, the net zero target, is based on the emissions that we produce here in the UK. So it's the UK produced emissions. And, you know, there's all sorts of good reasons why that's the right basis for a target. And the main one is that the UN requires it that way, that basically every country should take responsibility for its own emissions. But the UK is responsible for a much bigger footprint than that. And in particular, as a country, a trading country that imports a lot of the things that we consume, there's a bigger carbon footprint that we are responsible for. And there's some things we can do about that too. Now, it's an interesting topic for this discussion because government starts to run out of road on policies when it comes to many of those broader issues, because there are emissions that take place somewhere else. So with the best will in the world, with all of the UK exceptionalism that I can muster, you know, we cannot be responsible for the emissions further down the supply chain if they're in another country. So policies there don't tend to do very much. There is a debate about whether we might have some sort of trade policies around that. So you might have heard that the EU is considering things like carbon border adjustments, which is essentially just a tax at the border of the EU for high carbon goods that are imported. But in the absence of that kind of policy, my own belief is that the UK's carbon footprint, big as it is, it can be much better managed by UK corporates than it can by UK policy making. So paying attention to where the emissions in your supply chain are, giving the incentive to people in the supply chain to change that position as much as possible, thinking about what, you know, incentives in particular you can put in place through your procurement strategy, is a massive, massive step forward potentially for the UK on that broader issue of its total carbon footprint. The last thing I'll say is that that's the thing that really matters here. The total carbon that's being put into the atmosphere, it's not really, it doesn't matter where it comes from. It's a global issue. So once it's in the atmosphere, it mixes very quickly and you have the problem of global warming from it. So I think we do have to think about it in terms of the total footprint that we're responsible for. And I think that is an area where we could see a corporate lead to having more impact than UK focused policies.
Could I just come in
of course.
with a thought on that? Because you're also just thinking about, you know, I said that, you know, I think more and more companies are really recognizing they need to get on the front foot on this, and you know, absolutely put it as an issue of absolute prominence on the board agenda and so on. Clearly, one of the drivers for that is the increasing attention from investors. And for international companies, it's very clear that, you know, they're increasing. I mean, they should be held to account for their emissions wherever they are. You know, it's not a UK lens. It from that sort of corporate point of view, it's you know, all their emissions, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, wherever they are. And so, you know, they have to manage that bridge between, you know, the policies and all the supportive steps in the UK and grappling with perhaps their most polluting, most energy intensive operations elsewhere.
Emily,
I respond to that, Emily. I mean, just to say
sure,
that.
and I'll come to you next, Iain.
Oh, sorry, Iain. I didn't.
No, it's fine. Chris, you first, and then I'll come to you.
Very brief point. I've been dying to lever this in. That is just that point, really. That we are. I think we're on the cusp of something really remarkable, which is, you know, that through the TCFD framework. Which, if you're not familiar with it on this call, I would advise you go and have a look at it. But this is it trips off the tongue. This the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. So the financial disclosure rules around climate, I think, are the big game changer. They've been led in part, mainly actually, by Mark Cairnie's interest when he was at the bank. And the idea of disclosing those climate risks is really, really, really exciting. So the kind of two ways in which Mark Cairnie talks about it are the way I'll just try and summarize today. One is that the corporates face a risk from climate change itself, which is often hard to manage, and therefore not discussed at boardroom level. So what are the changes that we will see in the short term, it's with us now, that will impact on the value of the business, the physical risk. But the big one, actually, the exciting one, is the transition risk. So the idea that those corporates that are not fully wedded to the net zero journey that I've just talked about are going to suffer a fall in value, and that you can value that and disclose it. I think that is absolutely at the heart of how we might see a sea change actually in the corporate outlook on this. And already it's featuring in the discussion. So the bank is doing one of its stress tests of the financial sector this year, looking at those climate risks. And that idea of TCFD becoming mandatory is now part of the UK government's policy framework and armoury. So getting ahead of that, getting ready to disclose those financial risks and understanding how the climate is impacting on them is going to be, I think, a huge step forward.
Yeah, and getting our understanding about how to actually talk about those risks, I think, is going to be, a really helpful process. Ian, I'll come back to you to respond to this kind of conversation, but I also wanted to come back to something else that you mentioned, which is this point around, there's lots of much smaller businesses in the UK, and it's, for the bigger companies, having a sustainability department is something that's feasible, whereas for a lot of these companies, they just don't have the resource internally. So maybe a combination of sort of that, if you could draw on that point a little bit, and in the context of, should there be some support throughout a supply chain program, for example, to help some of the smaller companies. But again, it would be great just to kind of get your response to this broader international conversation, and then come to you on that one.
I'd like to respond in two ways, and I think those two things are joined, Emily.
Yeah.
On the point about the supply chain, the international dimension, 55% of UK emissions are derived within the UK. We are responsible for the majority of our emissions, but that varies vastly from sector to sector. So 3% of emissions in the pharmaceutical industry are international. In contrast, 90% of textiles are international, and that makes sense. And I think this comes to a really important point that Chris mentioned at the start about behavioural societal change. So fast fashion, you import a product, you wear it a couple of times, and then you send it to landfill. That has to change, from a societal point of view, in terms of, is there any way in which you can have, more sustainable, more enduring, sharing economy? All of that needs to be considered. How do we get rid of fast fashion in that way is really important. And then the second point I wanted to mention is, allowing people to use professional advisors, of which chartered accountants are really important. So, you could be thinking, I want to do something in this space, but I have no idea how to start. I think the TCFDs that Chris mentioned are important. I have to say, I think the Chapter Zero toolkit is really important as well, just to push you through the questions that you need to ask. But chartered accountants can identify, can help provide assurance on those metrics, and as a result, can bring down the cost of capital as well. So I think professional and business advisors are really important in this space. But Ruth mentioned that holistic approach, and I think prime companies working closely with their tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 suppliers to really improve reporting, manufacturing, the whole process is the means by which this works. This can't be done in isolation. This has to have a holistic approach involving the entire ecosystem, investors, primes, as well as suppliers.
Yeah, no, it's a really important piece, and it's maybe this next level of sophistication around collaboration with suppliers, with the government, with consumers. I mean, it's all going to be this next step. Maybe Ruth, to come to you. I asked Chris what he would want to sort of say to the board in terms of coming from a position of providing advice on what to do, but from your perspective of being in the boardroom, what would you want sort of more advice on? In particular, this point around when it comes to sort of policy levers that would be most helpful for businesses to make the right investment decisions, or any other kind of lever that you think would be useful for boards to be able to really get their heads around.
Well, let me just, I'll come to that, but let me just say something in response to what Iain just said,
Sure.
which is that sort of getting started on this. And I do think that, you know, whatever means, I also really like the Chapter Zero toolkit, and advisors, I think, play a very important role on this. Just as a sort of anecdote, because I was speaking at this event today, just this week, I've asked the sustainability lead in Babcock, just give me an update on where we're at. In my head, I was thinking of, Chris, you talked about the sort of the physical side of this. This is science, this is real. These are the real physical world steps that we need to take. And I got this great short, crisp summary, and I was really pleased with it. But it just struck me, there were so many, you know, acronyms of different organizations and different ways of measuring and different ways of doing this, that, and the other. It is a minefield for people to get their heads around. And I think, you know, finding ways for boards to cut through that and realize this is about the risk disclosure that you talked about, TCFD, and the real steps we need to take, the investments, the changes in ways of working, and so on. I think that, you know, Emily, to your question, I think so what I see when I look at businesses that I'm involved with is, you know, the difference between the things that you can get on and do anyway. And I'm a bit less pessimistic about the low-hanging fruit, Chris. I suspect there's still quite a lot to go at at a company level. You know, on the demand reduction through energy efficiency, and also and then in putting in renewables where possible, and changing processes to reduce energy. So I think that there's still a lot to go at. Then I think there's the class of something where we probably have a pretty clear idea of where we're going, but when and how do we make the investments? So what's the right time, and what are the right price assumptions, and so on, which you talked about as well. So for example, you know, how do we adopt EVs? What do we do first? How far do we go? And then if we have, you know, significant HGVs, what do we do about that? And I think that that is really about getting to that confidence and getting to the next level of detail on how those different pathways and everything that sits around those pathways, like the steps to drive down battery cost and so on, how that all comes together so that we have confidence in the assumptions that enable us to push further on investments into low carbon energy. And then, you know, then we have the areas which are really difficult. So for example, if I look at scope 1 emissions for Babcock, a significant part of that is aviation fuel used in helicopters that we use to fly emergency services. So search and rescue, emergency medical, and so on. You know, we don't know what to do about that yet. There are some things we can do, like using drones for some of the parts of the operation, but you know, that's going to obviously be a whole development with obviously government incentives and collaboration, and a whole challenge to decarbonize aviation as far as possible, which we will then have to adopt. So I think, yeah, we need different support for different parts of our journey, and the journey is going to be different for each company.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it is that sort of really getting to this nitty-gritty understanding of where the specific challenges are, because you know, you do need to unpack those big picture numbers to sort of start to think about individual challenges. But this has been super interesting. I'm going to come to you all now to get your sort of final sort of thoughts and comments, and in particular, if you could have a think about sort of, you know, what does this community in particular need to do? And it could be something very specific in the short term for COP, or it could be something very kind of important that's going to really help us to get to that sort of 2030 goal. But maybe just to come to you, Iain, first, you know, what is it that you think, you know, your community really needs to focus on in order to meet this net zero goal?
I think regardless of size of company, regardless of the sector that you're in, I think it has to come from the top, and it has to you have to have leadership on this. And from leadership comes governance and then risk management. And as I said, whether you're a two-person supply chain manufacturer in the West Midlands or your BP, that still model has to work. In terms of getting started, I think the Chapter Zero toolkit is a good starting point. I think, as Chris said, looking at the TCFDs, just in terms of the questions that need to be asked, are a useful starting point. But I think, you're not on this alone. This is a transition for an entire economy, an entire planet. And I think, talking, sharing experiences, we at ICAEW have started a sustainable community where chartered accountants and people in business can talk about these issues and learn from one another. You're not on your own. Starting out on that journey might seem a bit tough, but actually everyone is going through a similar step, has gone through a similar process, and we can learn together.
Well, that's really helpful. Thanks, Iain. And it sounds like there's a lot of support that you can, your organisation can provide as folks are going about this. And Ruth, from your perspective, what do you think both your kind of peers, but also Chapter Zero should be thinking about?
I think that my peers, what they can be doing now, wherever their companies are at on this spectrum, from the leaders to people just getting to grips with it, use this moment of the Prime Minister's 10-point plan, the carbon budget, the coming up to COP, to really push harder, have the confidence on your boards to push harder. Take the chairman to one side, ask, are we really driving this enough? And then push onto the next stage of this whole agenda. And I think for Chapter Zero, I think what they've achieved in the short time they've been around, I've only just joined, so I don't take credit at all, but I think that they've got fantastic toolkit, great events, to continue doing all of that. And I think the more we can get real case studies of how boards have, how members have actually managed to get the debate moving further on their boards, just sort of best practice on how to go about this will be really helpful.
Yeah, and I think you've both mentioned this point around leadership, which I think is quite a critical piece. I mean, there's lots of data and information and science, but I guess it is going to come down a lot to sort of personalities and strength of leadership to actually push ahead with some of the more difficult questions. And so I guess in that context, it's really great to have these sort of, leaders who've been joining us today to really kind of make sure that we can push the agenda in the boardroom. And maybe coming to you, Chris, kind of for the final word to wrap up this session. You've obviously, been working very, very closely with all sorts of different stakeholders in the context of the budget. Any final sort of suggestions of actions that this group can take going forward?
Well, a few words perhaps just to sum up. I mean, the first thing is not an action so much as an instruction to you all, which is to get excited about this, because it's happening. It's going to be, I think, the topic of the age. My key lesson is you really don't have to be an environmentalist to care about this stuff. It is a transition that we're now locked into. So really, this is about modernizing the business and being fit for the future. So getting excited about it, being optimistic is a big part of that too, of course. The more that you are confident in the business about the transition taking place, the more the government will be confident about putting in place the kind of conditions that you will need from them to make that go like the clappers, to use a technical term. And the other thing to say is that there's a kind of social license here as well for your customers. What we've seen when you look around the world is that those corporates that are ready for that net zero transition are the ones that are increasing their value. So, I mean, the extreme examples of that are obviously Tesla and a company like Ørsted, perhaps, which used to be an oil and gas company and now is completely divested. But, that's at the extreme end. But basically getting ready for that is value creation. It's not it's not an environmental policy that we need now. It's about moving towards where we know we will need to be shortly. So my final point really to say on that is that in your roles, in your corporate life, challenge the board on the basis of what they are doing on this. But if you're looking for some topical things to ask, that guide I mentioned, which hopefully we can share a link to after this, is really short. It's just 30 or so pages. It takes you through the suggested actions that we would expect from UK business. It's got a really nice set of points in there, across the sectors that we think UK businesses can do, things that can be done. So challenging on the basis of those real world things in that short guide is a good step into this, making the board responsible for overseeing that kind of change. And again, being optimistic and excited about it, and that being a part of the modernisation of the business. And I think we'll do it. It's really exciting moment.
Yeah, I really like that. I think it's a good place to end. I think we all need to get excited about it. I've certainly seen when companies get excited about this topic, the creativity and the innovation is just absolutely incredible. So really looking forward to what we're going to see next, really. And again, thank you all, really incredible speakers. Thank you for joining us this morning. Both the Institute for Chartered Accountants and Chapter Zero will be sending out notes to their members on this topic, and certainly will share, Chris, the report.
Great.
And please do get in touch if you've got any questions. So thank you all so much for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you.